Welcome to a very special Trench Chat. I'm really pleased this week to be joined by Matt Dixon of the Footsteps of the Fallen podcast. Somebody on Twitter a little while ago suggested that me and Matt got together and kind of interviewed each other, and Matt very kindly did that first, and I was on his podcast a few weeks ago, and if you've not listened to that yet, make sure you go and check that out, and we'll put some links on our podcast website for that. And now Matt's come to join us, and we're going to have a good old chat about the Great War this evening. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much indeed. How are you today?
Good. And yourself?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. And thank you very much for having me to come on and join you.
No, it's a pleasure. I always like to start, I think, as you do when you talk to people about the Great War. You know, how did you get to this point? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your path, as it were, to the Great War.
Well, I was very fortunate in one sense that I grew up in a house that was full of books. Both my parents are very, very well read people, and my father has a lifelong interest in World War One. He served in the military himself. He was a Royal Marines Commando in 4-5 Commando, and he'd always been interested in World War One. In fact, I think actually, if my memory serves me right, he took my mum to the Somme when they were on honeymoon, I think, on their way down to the Alps. I mean, who says that romance is dead? And I remember very, very clearly when I was growing up, he had this enormous collection of books on World War One, and I used to spend hours sitting on the floor in the living room where the bookcases were, sort of looking through these kind of books. And I remember this sort of I think it was kind of like an appalled sort of fascination with some of the pictures that I saw in there. There's obviously the very famous photograph of this skeleton lying in the mud outside the German dugout. I think it's a Beaumont Hamel, with the uniform with the arm across it, and it was sort of sort of a slightly appalled fascination with it, really. And I remember that he had a couple of books that I was particularly interested in. One was Before Endeavours Fade, by Rose Coombs, which he fortunately has a signed copy of. He met Rose Coombs in Ypres and signed a book, and a book by John Terraine as well that had some really remarkable pictures in it. And I sort of started really kind of getting into it from there. And my first sort of real taste of visiting the battlefields and the cemeteries, I suppose, we'd been on holiday in France, and we were driving back towards Calais, and it was back in the days before anyone had mobile phones to go on and sort of change your booking, and we were early. My father's usually impeccable timing had let him down, and we had about sort of 2 hours to kill. And I remember we swung off the motorway, and we stopped at a war cemetery, and that was Canadian Cemetery Number 2 at just by Vimy Ridge. And I can remember it to this day clear as anything. Obviously with the immaculate green. The thing that I remember very clearly was the lines in the green grass. They'd obviously just cut the grass very recently, and these immaculate sort of lines of white headstones. And then we went up to Vimy Ridge and went and looked at the memorial, and I was just fascinated by it. And I think I was probably only about maybe 10 years old at the time. I should think it's probably sort of 35 years ago or something like that. And I think that's kind of really sparked that interest. And I was very, very fortunate that my father didn't take much persuading to go for a trip over to the battlefields. And it sort of became a regular thing, really, that whenever, school holidays or half term, we'd always try and nip over for a day or something like that. And over a period of 20 years, I have no idea how many times we went, but it was an awful lot. And we traveled all over France and Belgium, and went to, across the sort of Verdun and the French sector and the Chemin des Dames. And then we went to Gallipoli and spent a week in Gallipoli with each other. And it really came from there. So I have my father solely to blame for this interest. And I think really as I've got older, it's kind of become more than an interest. It's become this sort of all-encompassing passion, really. It's for me now, it's the first thing I think about in the morning, and the last thing I think about at night. And it doesn't matter, how my day at work has been. I've always got time to be able to sit down and have a look at a war diary or something like that. And when you're doing things like the podcast or you're researching anything, it doesn't feel like work. It's just a pleasure. It doesn't matter how tired you are or how bad your day's been. You can immerse yourself in this history. And I think the thing that I always enjoy about it is you never stop learning. I'm by no stretch of the imagination an expert on World War One. I know a bit, but there's a lot of people out there who know an awful lot more than I do, and that for me really excites me. It's that journey. There's so much out there to learn, and every day's a school day, isn't it? And and I think that's what keeps driving that passion. I had obviously there was a family connection. Some of my dad's family served in the Great War. They were all cavalry soldiers. So they served in the 9th Lancers, the Queen's Own Oxford Hussars. I think there was a couple served in the South Wales Borderers as well. So there was kind of that sort of family history connection with it there. And I remember every year seeing the family medals coming out of the safe and sort of looking at them and holding them. And I think at the time I probably was too young to really understand the significance of them. But now when I look back at them and, I have the medals to an old contemporary who lost his life in 1914, it's a very, very special moment. And it's something that I've been able to share with my son as well. And, who knows, maybe he might become interested in it as well.
Well, let's hope so. Let's hope so. And you're absolutely right about, continuing to learn. I think the more you study it, the vastness of the subject, and it takes you down all kind of, communication trenches to other places. And that's the beauty of it, because you find so much to explore and discover, don't you?
Well, I think that's true, and I mean one of the things that I'm extremely good at is procrastinating. And I start looking at something, and then I will read something else, and then I'll start reading about that, and then 2.5 hours later, I've forgotten what it was that I was originally starting to look at. But I've been happy for 2.5 hours because I'm going off in all these different directions and looking at all these different things. I don't think sometimes I need to be slightly more organised than I am and stop procrastinating so much. But it's a great way of discovering things that you didn't know before.
No, absolutely. And I remember you saying, I think in one of your podcasts, that you lived in France for a little while.
I did, yes. So I lived in Nancy over in Lorraine, so obviously very close to Verdun. Obviously, a lot of fighting there in early stages of the war, and so went on to sort of later on towards 1918 and that sort of thing. So yes, that was how I got to sort of visit the areas around Bar-le-Duc and up to Verdun and that sort of thing. So and it's one of those places where when you walk around and you look, you discover actually there's World War One history even in the city itself that perhaps you might not otherwise realize. So it was a real privilege to be out there, and obviously the contribution that the French made in that particular area, and obviously the suffering they went through as well. I think it's sort of omnipresent really wherever you go around that kind of area. And it was fairly close to the Vosges as well. That wasn't too far away. It was about sort of a couple of hours, something like that. So I used to go down and spend weekends down there, and I remember seeing the vast cemeteries down there. So I was very lucky to have that opportunity.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think living in France, we look at the Great War because of our family backgrounds on from a British point of view. But when you do spend time and you have the opportunity, like you did, to live in France, you see how big a thing the Great War was in 20th century French history, and how the echoes of it haven't really gone away, have they?
No, absolutely. And I think one of the problems sometimes that we have is that nations kind of have a tendency to get focused on their own contribution, and what that sometimes means is we overlook the contribution played by other people. And I think the French sector of World War One, the French sector of the line, I mean, I've been fortunate enough that I have visited areas of it, I've explored it, but do I really understand it? No. But that offers a whole world of opportunities. It just means I'll have to go back to France again, which is a terrible thing. But no, I think you're right, and I think when you start looking at just the sort of the catastrophic impact that the fighting had on France as a nation, and you then start to understand really why there is still that poignancy about it and why it's so important to the kind of the psyche of the country, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, almost every other street has got some kind of military history aspect to it in terms of the naming of it and war memorials everywhere. Yeah, the French contribution is such a big one and part of our understanding of our own side of the Great War.
I think one of the things also that I always enjoy doing is French war memorials are magnificent, aren't they? When you go around some of these and you see these incredible statues of these sort of, the heroic Poilu with his, his rifle and what have you. And I mean, they I'm not sure if this is the right expression, but they do it well.
And then they did all those ones where you got a Poilu stamping on a Prussian eagle, which then got them into trouble when the Germans came back 20 odd years later.
Absolutely marvelous. I mean, yeah, I think we should have more of this sort of thing.
That's right. It's certainly an interesting culture thing. I think that I find a lot of modern visitors can't quite understand the animosity between French and German people, or certainly France and Germany, let's say. But then, having lived there, and I'm sure you felt the same, you sense it, particularly in older generations. Whether that will change as generations that really have, never known any kind of war. Germany's been their ally. Maybe that'll be different. I don't know.
Yes, I mean possibly. I mean, it is interesting because I remember being at Verdun and up at Douaumont, and I think it's very hard really to think of any place actually really in World War One that has more significance for France than Verdun. And there was a sort of coach party, I think, of probably lycée students or something like that. And I mean, I have to say that the behavior was awful, and the teachers were doing nothing to sort of deal with this. But I hope that that's not reflective of the way that the young are viewing sort of the history of their country, and particularly I think when you look at something like Verdun and the place that it holds in the history of France. I mean, I spent a lot of time working in Paris, and when I used to go back to get the Eurostar back from Gare du Nord, you'd go through Gare de l'Est, and it's still got the signs underneath with Verdun written on them, and that always struck a chord with me when I went to see it. And I always used to wonder what it was like back at that particular time. I wonder what the station must have been like during those war years.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think that there's something about trains in the Great War actually, and going to big stations like that. You think of the general mobilisation order in France when all those hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen were dispatched across different parts, rejoin at barracks and all that kind of stuff. It must have been quite something. And those names that were there on the railway signboards became the great battles of the First World War.
No, well, absolutely. And I mean, obviously, when we used to go from Nancy, if we ever got the train across to Paris, you went through places like Bar-le-Duc and that sort of thing. And of course, there's just history everywhere.
Yeah, you can't escape it there. And that's a great thing. Now, all these years of tramping around the battlefields, many of us, you end up writing and doing something. And I'm pleased that, you've taken that path, which a few of us have done now, and you've produced a podcast, a highly successful podcast, Footsteps of the Fallen, where you talk about some of the journeys that you've made and the things that you've done. What really kind of inspired you to go down that route with a podcast?
Well, I think it's one of those things that I'd kind of been thinking about doing it for a while, and then it was one of those things that you kind of never get around to it. And I think, like many of us, we found ourselves in lockdown, and my dear wife said to me, she said, "Well, you don't talk about anything else, so why don't you record it, and then perhaps somebody other than me will have to listen to it." I don't think she said it quite in those terms, but I think that was the underlying sort of message that was coming across. And I kind of ummed and ahed about it really, and I have to be honest. I think one of the things that was perhaps most challenging was I decided to release it at a time when some very eminent historians on World War One, yourself, Peter Hart, Matt McLaughlin, professional military historians, also decided to start producing podcasts. And there was a little bit of me, and it's like, well, who realistically is going to want to listen to what an amateur's got to say when you have this dearth of expertise out there? And I remember having a conversation with you, and you were like, well, come on, when are you going to get this first one released? And it was like, well, I'm going to take the plunge and we'll see how it goes down. And actually, the first episode I ever released is still the most popular one of all the ones I've released, closely followed by my interview with you, I hasten to add. So you've taken the second spot, but that really was it. I think it's one of those things that I think podcasting, if it is something that you are hugely passionate about, and it's something that's such a big part of your life, it's quite easy to sit and talk about it because it kind of comes naturally. And I have to say, I mean, I've been absolutely blown away by the response that the podcast has had. I mean, I thought, to be honest, when I started it, I had a few friends on sort of social media who I thought, might be polite and listen to it. And I thought, my mum might tune in and that kind of thing. And I've actually absolutely been blown away by it. And the feedback has been amazing. And I think as long as people keep enjoying what we're producing, then, I will keep on producing podcasts. And I think it's a bit of a golden age really for military history podcasts. I think we're very lucky to be proud of that, and I think to be part of that. And I think the most important thing really is that it doesn't matter what your background is, whether you have an academic background or you just have a real interest in it. Everybody has something to say and everybody has an opinion on it. And I think that's the beauty of podcasts, is that it gives an opportunity for everybody to talk about their favorite subject. And if you asked 5 military historians to talk about the fighting at Polygon Wood, for example, you're going to get 5 different podcasts that come out of it. And I think that's the beauty of it. And I think the way it's sort of come out, and I think the way that it's panned out, is that the various podcasts, I think they actually complement each other really well, because everybody has a different style of presentation and a different style of sort of content. And I think what it does is it sort of puts the various pieces of the puzzle together. And I think that's the beauty of it. I mean, there are occasions where, I suddenly realise that it's Friday and I haven't actually recorded Sunday's podcast and that kind of thing. And you think, oh, what am I going to talk about? What am I going to do? But actually, it's never been a chore. It's always been a pleasure doing it. And I hope that continues for a long time.
Well, I hope so too. I mean, I certainly listen every week. It's a fascinating podcast. And like you say, I think it's a very democratic medium, podcasting, because it doesn't matter who you are, you've got the ability to put your voice out there. And I think having these different voices is really, really important. And I hope that it feels done as if podcasts are here to stay, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I did wonder, to be honest, whether when sort of lockdown ended, or first lockdown ended, whether there was going to sort of like, it was going to tail off because people were going back to work and, didn't have the time at home. But actually, I think if anything, it's got more popular. I mean, I've kind of got to the stage now, and I'm sure you're the same, that actually I don't really look at the downloads very often anymore. But, I think when you first start, you're there every sort of like 2 hours having a look to see, what's going on. And I think now it's a case of you've sort of built an audience. There are people that are going to listen to it, so it becomes less important, really. And I think what's more important is focusing on producing decent and interesting content for people. And it's taken some time. It's been over a year that the podcast has been running now, but I think we've sort of built up a kind of reasonable following to it. And people will listen because people want to hear what you have to say, and say that's the beauty of it, definitely. But I think you're right. I think it has increased in popularity. I think it is here to stay, and long may that continue. And I think the more people that produce podcasts on World War One, whatever your particular interest in that is, then everybody has something to add, and everything adds value. So let's have more of them.
Definitely. And I think what's interesting is if you look at kind of mainstream media and what is being produced on military history or history generally, then it's often, I would say, not of very high quality, and the kind of depth that people, I think, want from it is sadly lacking. Modern television's approach to constructing stories about the Great War are often quite ephemeral, I think, really. Whereas with a podcast and you're in total control of it. You can go down avenues that those kind of programs can't or won't. So, and like you say, I think it opens up the potential for lots of different voices. I mean, millions of men served in the Great War. They all had different views of it. They came back. Some liked it, some loved it, some hated it, some wished they'd never been there. And each one of them saw a battle in a different way. So why shouldn't there be lots of people who 100 years later then talk about those battles in different ways and the aspects of the war? And I think, as we said when we chatted ourselves before, I'd love to see more of the next generation of historians that are coming forward now to begin to put their voices into things like this, because that's really important. I'm sure it's a developing voice in their case, but I think they've got a lot to say.
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely, I think it's absolutely vital. I think as well, what for me is always really important is if it means that you open up this sort of particular study of history and this particular world-changing event that the Great War was, and it suddenly creates a spark of interest in somebody who maybe hasn't been interested in that before, then that on its own is the reason to keep podcasting. Even if one person learns something that they didn't know before, then for me, that's the greatest reward I could possibly get from podcasting, is just sharing that. And I think it's absolutely important. And I think as well, particularly with the younger generation, with this kind of electronic sort of generation of youngsters, podcasting or listening to podcasts is not seen as uncool because you can do it on your phone and that kind of thing. And I think as well, if it encourages, particularly as you say, that younger generation to generate an interest in history and the Great War itself, then it's got to be worth doing it.
No, definitely. And I mean, a big focus of your podcast are personal stories about the Great War, things that you've researched. That's a big part of what you do, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think for me, it's been something very important since I started doing the podcast is I want to tell the personal stories of the men that were there. And I suppose really the kind of the genesis of that was from sort of listening to various podcasts. I think there are lots of words have been written about the Great War, and goodness me, there's more Great War books out there than you can possibly shake a stick at. If people wish to learn, I don't know, about the Battle of the Somme or Passchendaele, there are hundreds of books out there that will introduce you to the subject. And for me, I think it was very important to tell the human stories of individuals within the Great War, because ultimately it was those men that fought the battle. And I think really this came for me very much. I remember having a trip over to the battlefields. I think I'd probably been going there for, I don't know, maybe 20 years or something like that. So it's a reasonably long time. And what my love is visiting the cemeteries of World War One. It always has been, and I hope it always will be. And I remember being at a very small cemetery, Zouave Valley, just up from sort of around a Vimy Ridge, sort of Willowvale, that sort of way. And I was sitting on the wall around the cemetery eating my lunch, and of course, I mean, I was the only person there, as it comes as a sort of no great surprise. And I had this extraordinary sort of moment came to me. I want to sort of say sort of like a road to Damascus experience or something like that. But I suddenly realized something that I'd never realized before, that this wasn't just a cemetery. These weren't just headstones, that every single name on there is somebody's grief. It's someone's loss. That's somebody's son there. And every single name, every single person is a story to be told. And for me, it completely changed my whole mindset about why it's important for me personally to visit the cemeteries and see the names. It's not just a name. That is somebody's sorrow. That's someone's sadness. Somebody loved that man. And it's that sort of personal narrative and that personal story was something that I really wanted to bring into the podcast. So you can go and read a book about the Battle of the Somme or Passchendaele or Arras. What you perhaps can't do so easily is to tell the personal stories of the men that were involved in it. And that was something when I started the podcast was very, very important for me to do. And it's something that I hope I've managed to sort of continue through the episodes. I always try and pick one person, be that a Victoria Cross winner, or maybe just someone who discovered some information about from a diary or from a letter or something like that, and try and give that person a name. And as I said, for me, that's something very important in the podcast.
Well, I think it's what gives your podcast its depth, because anyone can assemble a load of facts about a battle or an engagement or a campaign or whatever, and kind of repeat those. But once you start slotting in the stories of those ordinary guys in extraordinary circumstances, that's when it becomes more human, and you can relate to it, I think, and engage with it in a completely different way and understand it through their eyes.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously, I mean, you have to look at the scale of the losses that were involved. That there's a million stories out there to be told, and everybody that was there did their bit in some small way, shape, or form, and we shouldn't overlook that. As I said, I mean, this sort of experience that I had, it really was. It just totally changed my perception of it. And I'm really glad that it happened to me in one sense, because I think personally, I get a lot more satisfaction from visiting cemeteries now. And I mean, one of my real loves whenever I go over to the battlefield, yes, cemeteries like, Tyncott and Sayre Road number 2 and Lissenthuyck, absolutely, they have a place. But for me, I like the small cemeteries. I like the ones that are off the beaten track. I like the ones where you look in the visitors book and there's only been 3 people have signed it that year or something like that. And they're the ones that I want to visit now. And I think probably like yourself, is I've been fortunate enough that I've visited the Western Front so many times that I've done Thiepval and I've done Tyncott and that sort of thing. Not to say that I'm not going to go back to them at all, but I want to explore other areas. I want to explore areas that are perhaps a little bit more off the beaten track. And this sort of led into really the podcast, because one of the things that I wanted to do was focus on perhaps areas that don't normally get covered by sort of mainstream history or that sort of thing. And I think really the two of them kind of melded together. It was this telling these personal stories and looking at some of the areas that don't normally get covered. And the podcasts that I've really enjoyed doing were things like on Trones Wood, on Bernafay Wood, and things like that many visitors to the Somme would have driven past it, perhaps on way somewhere, but actually there's stories that need to be told about that. The fighting in Artois in 1915 of Neuve Chapelle and Festubert and Aubers Ridge and things like this. So it's really important to, I think, move beyond the kind of the archetypal textbook version of World War One and look at some of these smaller actions, look at some of these lesser known places. It's like your podcast the other day on Hayley Station. I mean, fascinating. Just we'll take one cemetery. And I really enjoy doing the cemetery walk episodes. We just pick a cemetery, and there's so much history there. There's so much to say. And I think the problem really with some of these podcasts, it's actually, what do I take out? Because there's so much I want to talk about. There's so many stories I want to tell. And that's what makes it exciting for me.
No, definitely. And I think it's when you start to look at it in the way that we do when we produce a podcast, you realise how rich the Great War is in these stories. And like you say, it's not struggling to find things to include. It's actually thinking, what am I going to have to leave out? Otherwise, I'm going to be talking to these people all day. And I'm sure some would like it, but we've got to draw a line somewhere.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it would also take too much editing, because one of the things that it also takes me to do is edit all the ums and ers out of when I'm doing it. Somebody actually said to me that they said, I was terribly impressed. It said, like, you've gone through the whole thing and I didn't hear a single and er. And it's like, well, it's because I spent 4 hours editing them out, basically. So that's why you didn't hear anything in there.
Yeah. And I think also with the personal stories, and going off the beaten track, as you say. I mean, one of your episodes I particularly liked was the Gardeners of Salonika, looking at that Macedonia and that front that very few people even realise existed, let alone that British soldiers and men from many nations were there. So I think, that is, I mean, you'd never get a documentary commissioned on that, not for mainstream television, but I put a podcast out about that I think is a great thing.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the things that, there is a definite tendency, I think, amongst Great War sort of historians and podcasters and researchers and that sort of thing, that we do get fixated with the Western Front. And it was called the World War for a reason, because it was a global conflict. And yes, you have Salonika, there's Mesopotamia, there's East Africa, there's Gallipoli. There's this whole world of conflict out there. And, I think that's what makes it so exciting. And I think, I enjoyed the one about Salonika. It's one of those places that I think, as you say, it's largely unheard of. And I think as well, people forget very much about the fighting that took place in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq. And of course, I mean, that's particularly prescient now when you look at what's happened over the last sort of 20 years, that we're back there again under completely different circumstances. And it's really interesting. I mean, I've got something planned that I'm going to do in the near future about the African campaign in East Africa, because I mean, that was remarkable when you look at what happened there. So I think it's good to sort of pick these things, and as I say, if it helps sort of maybe introduce somebody to something that they weren't aware of before, then that's a very good reason to keep talking about these lesser known places.
Definitely. Now, you're in the preparation of working on a couple of books. I think your first one's coming out next year. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, so this has been a bit of a sort of 20-year labour of love, really. It sort of came about, really. The interest started back in 2001. I was off work. I'd actually fallen down a flight of stairs and had broken a leg. And I was at home. And once the novelty of going to the pub every day had worn off, which didn't take very long, to be honest, one of the things that I decided to do was to teach myself how to use this newfangled invention called the internet, which was this amazing thing. And of course, one of the first things that I started doing was looking at things to do with World War One and that sort of thing. And I came across various websites from various schools around the country who'd produced websites about their war dead and those that had died in World War One. And it made me start thinking, I wonder if anybody has done this for my old school or not. So I went to a school called Bloxham, which was up in Oxfordshire, so near Banbury. It was and still is a small public school, and it was in existence at the time of the First World War. And I'm very ashamed to admit, actually, when I look at this now, that I spent 6 years at the school, and I probably couldn't have told you that there was actually a war memorial in the chapel. I used to go to chapel there 3 times a week, but I guess when you're of that age, you're a teenager, you perhaps have other interests and that sort of thing. But I got in contact with the school and asked them whether they had any sort of biographical information. And the chap who was the archivist there, a fantastic man by the name of Shaw McClory, Major Shaw McClory, Major Mac, as he was known. He was the archivist. He was an absolutely eccentric character, Major Mac, and he had a sort of a nominal list of names, and it contained some very basic kind of biographical information about the men. But what became very obvious was that there was no one had ever done a really, really in-depth study of them, about what happened to them, who were they, where did they come from. And it really came from there. And so I got all the names and I plotted them onto an Excel spreadsheet, and I went onto the Commonwealth War Graves and I found where they were commemorated. And I was incredibly lucky, actually, that the vast majority of them had headstones instead of being names on memorials, which is, when you look at this sort of like some of the research projects I've done later on, it's incredibly fortunate as to how many of them had headstones. And having sort of plotted this out, I set off to Belgium. And I arrived in Ypres on the wettest day I've ever seen on the Ypres salient. It was biblical rain.
Rain in Flanders, can't believe it.
No, absolutely. I mean, it was kind of the rain where you stop and take a photograph and your wellies are filling up with it, and you're kind of you're walking across the cemeteries and there's water squelching out from underneath your boots. And I went to Menin Road South and found the grave of a man called Lieutenant Archibald Horner, who served in Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and his was the first grave that I visited of the men from my old school. And this kind of went on really for the next kind of 15 or so years. And I became very, very good friends with a chap called Simon Batten, who is a history teacher at school and is now the school archivist, who is incredibly passionate about World War One. And he was particularly helpful with it. And I produced a website. And I think the first website I produced, if it was a school report, would probably have said could do better. So that was up and running for a couple of years. And then I produced a new one, which I think was a vast improvement on this. And Simon actually wrote an award-winning book on World War One himself that was published by the publishers. And when we were having a conversation with the publishers, we were telling them about the website, and they suggested, well, why don't you make this into a book? I think it's really, really interesting. So we took the biographies of the men. When we started the project, there were 76 names on the school war memorial. There's now 80. Wow. So we found 4. Simon found 3 of them. I came across one of them, and we were very fortunate in one sense that the school actually had portrait photographs of nearly all of them. Wow. Sadly, there was a fire at the school, I think in the 1980s, and one of the photo frames was destroyed in the fire. But we have now managed to recollect photographs of all of them. So all 80, we have pictures of them, and they now hang in the school where they used to, and it's really come from there. So obviously I was very fortunate that Simon, as a sort of published historian, he brought his kind of author's eye to it, and with his knowledge of the school and that sort of thing. So really what we've done is written the biographies of the men, but then also looked at the way schools, and particularly small public schools, commemorated the war dead in not only at the time of the war, but in the immediate aftermath, and how remembrance has changed for schools since the end of the First World War. So that's due, I believe, to be published hopefully early next year. So it's sort of like the end of an odyssey, really. And I'm sure you must have felt this with some of your projects, that when you finally put that last full stop on something that you've been so involved in for so long, there's almost like this kind of tinge of sadness that you don't want it to stop, because it's almost like, well, what on earth am I going to do now? Yeah, it didn't take long to find something else, but and that's really where it came from.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think the whole memorialization, the history of memorialization, is a fascinating subject in its own right, and it's interesting how many cases I hear of, like the one you've just described, where once you begin to look at it now from the kind of research that we can do these days, how many names were omitted from war memorials, and why was that?
I think a lot of the ones that we found were that parents simply didn't tell the school that they'd received news of the death. Now, one can only imagine in certain circumstances the grief was such that actually, it was just the last thing on my mind was to be writing to the school to tell them that that my son has died. And there was one of the men actually was discovered through a chance discovery whilst looking through the Australian National Archives, and it came up with a reference to Bloxham College, and the man's attestation papers had been incorrectly filled in. Of course, it should have said Bloxham School on it, and so that was really, I'd say, very much a chance discovery that we came with that. But I think really the other ones really just the parents didn't actually let the school know, and nobody at the time thought to check up, or maybe that there wasn't the means to check up as to what had happened to these boys. But I'm very proud and I'm very glad that these names have been added onto the war memorial now, and rightly they should. I just hope once the book's gone to the publishers, we don't discover anybody else.
Well, you never know. I mean, I found myself that once you start putting this stuff out there, people step forward and they come up with new photographs, new information, and that's all part. Going back to the podcast, that's all part of the kind of evolving nature of this. Is that there isn't a last word on any of it. There's new information all the time.
Well, I've been through the 1911 census for the school, and I've cross-referenced every single name on there with the Commonwealth war graves and with soldiers died on the Great War. And I cannot find anybody that we aren't already aware of that lost it. So I'm kind of hoping in one sense that is it. But then, of course, there'd always be that little like frisson of excitement when you find a name that you haven't heard before, or you find a reference to the school, you think, I wonder, is that another one? I know it's been really interesting as well. I mean, it took me through, down some really sort of interesting research sort of opportunities. One of the things that I was trying to do for many, many years was I was trying to find a photograph of a particular officer. And unfortunately, his surname was Smith, and he was in the Royal Fusiliers, which was, not a great starting point given how many battalions there were and such a common name. After about, 12 years of searching, whilst this was before everything was digitized, I was at the newspaper archives in Colindale, up in northwest London, and I came across a supplement to one of the London newspapers that they used to publish, and they produced this supplement called in the Name of the Fallen, and they would have the sort of the pen portraits of officers predominantly officers who'd been killed in combat. And I using that, I worked out that there was normally about a 6 to 7 week gap between an officer dying and him appearing. And Julie went through it, and sure enough, I managed to find a photograph of Second Lieutenant James Clement Smith of the Royal Fusiliers. And for me, when you've been doing something for 12 years or something like that, you've been trying to find the photograph. It's so exciting, and it's wonderful. And I think that's the beauty of history. You get these subjects, and you get so involved in them, and when you finally find that missing piece of the jigsaw, the buzz you get from it, unless you do that yourself, it's impossible to understand why you'd get so excited about a small photograph in a newspaper.
Well, that's it. And I think that the passion that you have for this subject and the way you describe it both in your podcast and talking about your book now is something that comes across strongly. So that's your first book. You're going to move on to another subject after that.
Yes. So I am currently working on the first section of a book on the fighting at Festubert in 1915. It's been well, anyone who listens to the podcast will know I have a particular affinity to the battlefields of Artois and the fighting in 1915. But Festubert has always been something that I've been really, really interested in. And I think what I feel very much about it is it's rather been unfairly lumped in as a sort of continuation of the fighting at Aubers, from the 9th of May. And I always felt this was rather unfair because actually it represented, I think, a very significant change in British tactics in the way that they went about battle. It was the first night attack of the First World War. It was the first time the Canadians were fighting alongside the British in an action. And it's been really, really interested me for many, many years. And I thought, well, it only gets almost like a cursory mention, even in the official history. I think there's only about 17 pages or something like that in the whole of the official history. And I just thought, actually, do you know what? It's something that fascinates me. I'm really interested in it. Let's write a book about it. So that's where I am at the moment. It's at very early stages at the moment, but I find myself disappearing down various wormholes in the research and that sort of thing. And hopefully I can do those men justice.
And Festubert, like you say, sort of marks that move in 1915 from kind of stumbling around, doesn't it, really, into the new world of warfare on the Western Front.
Yeah, very much so. And I think one of the criticisms, obviously, that gets sort of sometimes rather unfairly pointed towards First World War generals is that they were devoid of ideas. There was no new sort of thinking about how we should do things. But actually, when you look at what happened at Aubers and then you look at what happened at Festubert, they recognised the errors and they recognised the shortcomings of the battle plan. And it really was a case of, okay, well, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to think about this differently? So instead of this lightning quick bombardment of artillery that you had with Aubers, this was this slow, deliberate bombardment with heavy howitzers, and we're going to focus specifically on strong points in the German line, and we're going to have forward observation officers that are going to feed back and tell us. I mean, as it happened, it was a disaster, but it does demonstrate that there wasn't this kind of like Stone Age mindset that we'll just keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. And I think Festubert really, as I say, was, as you say, I think it was the turning point in sort of British military strategy and British military thinking. And it did demonstrate that, yes, we are prepared to try new things to see, you know, if it will work. As it happened, of course, as we know, it didn't. But I think, as I say, to sort of level this criticism of this, there was no change. It was just this you know, sending infantry against machine guns. That is, I think it's a slightly myopic view of what actually happened.
Yeah, definitely, and I think that part of the battlefields as well is so greatly unchanged that when you go there, having done research in war diaries and official history and things, you know, you can really kind of piece it together.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was over there probably about a month ago now, I think, and we spent an afternoon. We walked up the cinder track and across in front of what we, you know, the Ferme Cœur du Havre, and across the dike that was there. And you're touching history, as you say. I mean, I always think that if you were to bring some of the chaps back, they'd probably recognise some of this, and for being there in the modern world, that's really exciting. I think it's changed so little, as you say, particularly Artois. I think that is particularly so, yeah, it's tangible and it's touchable. And I think the thing I particularly like about the battlefields in Artois is it's so compact, so you can walk an entire battlefield in an afternoon or something like that. And so if you've done a little bit of research beforehand and you understand, you know, what's going on. I mean, I think I said to you that as just at the as you come back up the Rue du Bois, there's the playing fields, and they've got the signs about Lowther's lambs and the Boar's Head fighting in 1916. And I'd listened to your podcast on that sort of the weekend before that I went there, and it was like that for me. It brings it all to life because you're there and you're touching history. But as I said, I think really 1915, with the exception of perhaps Loos and Gallipoli, the Western Front gets overlooked, and I think that's so sad because there was so much happened. There was so much happened, and there were so many lessons that were learned. It's very sad that we don't look at battles like Neuve-Chapelle and Aubers and Festubert and that sort of thing in the same way that we do with some of the sort of, you know, the offensives or actions that took place later in the war.
No, definitely, and I think as well, aside from the tactical side of it, it was a change in the British Army from this pre-war volunteer regular army, then the arrival of the territorials, and by the time you get to Loos, the first arrival of men from the new army, from in many cases from that very first 100,000.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know, and obviously, what a contribution those men made, and you know, I mean, losing itself. I mean, that's a whole nother story about, you know, what went wrong there. But I think for me, one of the things that I always find particularly important about the fighting in 1915 is that yes, whilst casualties were horrendous, and actually in real terms, there was very little ground was actually gained at all whatsoever. But what was gained was an enormous amount of knowledge about how to fight a battle in these circumstances. And I think you really have to look at things like, you know, the fighting at Neuve-Chapelle, that it's taking the German front lines actually quite easy. Holding on to it, that's a completely different matter. And there's no doubt, I think, to my mind, that when you look at the fighting in 1915, it was the lessons that were learned in 1915 that changed the direction of the way the conflict went from the British point of view. Of course, it's terribly sad and terribly poignant when you think that the price of those lessons were the thousands of men who lost their lives. But ultimately, I think if you hadn't had those actions in 1915, the overall course of the war and the way that the war panned out, I think, would have taken a very different route.
No, I think you're absolutely right. So I very much look forward to that book on Festa, but I think it's, books on some of those forgotten battles of the Great War are long, long overdue. Now, you were out on the battlefields quite recently, and I've been out there as well myself. As we head back towards a period of probably difficulty in travelling over there, as we look to next year, how do you feel about the future of battlefield visiting and the battlefields themselves?
Well, I mean, I certainly hope for all my friends over in France and Belgium that rely on people who go over to visit the battlefields, that these restrictions, whilst absolutely necessary, and I understand why they're in place, I hope that they are, or certainly relaxed or reduced to an extent that people can get back to the battlefield and start visiting it. I have friends out in Belgium who I know that have suffered terribly through the lack of people going out there. And, I think I went actually the longest that I've been without ever visiting the Western Front. I went all 2 years without getting over there. And in real terms, when you think about it, actually, in the greater scale, when you look at the reasons behind it, the circumstances, well, okay, fine. It's yes, I'd quite like to visit it, but I kind of understand why I can't. But I mean, I'm hoping very much that once we've ridden out this current sort of peak that we're in at the moment, these current problems that we're in, that the opportunities for visiting the battlefields will present themselves again. I mean, I miss Ypres terribly, I really do. And I think one of the things actually that I found out and I was very surprised about during lockdown was I didn't realize how much I was going to miss visiting the battlefields and how much I was going to miss visiting the cemeteries of World War One. And it really surprised me, actually. It was almost like I felt kind of like a sort of right arm had gone, sort of thing. There was like a little bit of me was missing. I mean, I think we all had this kind of thought, didn't we, when there was the centenary, of the Great War, and of course there was this surfeit of programs and interest, quite rightly, about what happened. I think there was maybe a thought, perhaps is interest going to tail off now that we've gone past the 100th anniversary? And I think I'm really pleased to see actually that no, if anything, I think it's stronger than ever before. And I'm certain that things like podcasts are contributing towards that. But I depending on how nicely I talk to my wife, hopefully I will get back over to the battlefields next year. I've certainly got some plans to make some trips over there. I just haven't mentioned that I'd like to go to Gallipoli for a week, but we'll see whether I can get that one past her or not.
Well, I hope so. And do you think, the kind of production of the sort of podcast that we've been doing and others as well, do you think that might have kind of changed the way people see battlefields as well?
Well, I think it probably has. I mean, I think one of the things that podcast does, and I think you touched on this earlier, is it brings cemeteries to life. Which is kind of a strange thing to say, actually, when you think about it, because it's sort of a bit of an anathema when you say that. But yes, I think it probably has. And what it's, I think when you tell the stories of the human side, like you do with yours and I do with mine, hopefully that encourages people to go, well, actually, whilst, cemeteries are obviously the resting place of the dead, we need to remember that kind of ethos of the Commonwealth War Graves, that they shouldn't be places of sorrow. They should be places of memory and places to remember and places to reflect. And they are incredibly beautiful war cemeteries. And that's a really strange thing to say. And I know that, if you said that to someone who perhaps is not a World War One fanatic or a history fanatic, they go, oh, what on earth are you talking about? It's a cemetery, But actually, when you go there and you look at the care that they're looked after with and the horticulture and the flowers, I mean, there is nothing better, is there? When you go to a war cemetery in late summer and the flowers are in full bloom, they are beautiful. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. They are absolutely beautiful. So I think if we can kind of bring that across to people, and you can bring across that actually this isn't all about morbidity, and it's not all about the thousands of people that died. This is human history. This is human stories that need to be told. And I think if people can get that feeling through podcasts, and it encourages somebody that actually the next time I'm driving through France and I see a war cemetery, I might just pull the car over and just go and have a look, because we've heard about the way the headstones are designed, and we've heard about that there's no difference between whether it's a brigadier general or a private. Maybe it would be quite interesting. Maybe I'll have a look. Maybe I'll stop. And I think if that happens, once again, that's a real reason why we should carry on podcasting, because it opens it up and it makes it more accessible to people.
Definitely. I had a truck driver on Twitter say to me that he regularly drives down the A1 towards Paris, or perhaps back again, and passes some of the cemeteries of the Great War on that route, and has often wondered about them. Could I do some podcasts on them? So I think it shows what the kind of power of those podcasts could be to help inform people, and like you say, make them stop. Because I feel that aside from all the history side of it, there are lessons to be drawn by going to these places, because they are gardens of remembrance, as you say, and places to reflect not just on the past, but the present, and maybe even the future, and how we live our own lives and what we draw from the lessons of these men. Men who often didn't get a chance to really live a proper life, and it puts an onus on us to do that ourselves, maybe.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that kind of sort of touches on the reason why we study history. And I remember having this conversation with Simon Batten, who I was talking about earlier, on one of our trips to the battlefield. And I remember asking him the question, saying, well, you're a history teacher. Why does history matter? And it's because it teaches us to learn from the mistakes of the past. And that's why it's important that we study it, because, we only have to look back through history. There are two things that have caused more problems in history than anything else. One is religion, and the other is war. And warfare has shaped the way our world is today. And I think it's vitally important, that we don't forget that, and we do continue that study, and we do continue looking at it. And as you said, if we can help a new generation of young historians come in and embrace this subject, then hopefully just finally that idea that we're going to learn from the lessons of the past might actually come to fruition.
Well, let's hope so. And in terms of podcasts, I mean, how do you, I think we've accepted that they're here to stay, and how do you see them kind of going forward? What do you think the future of the sort of podcasts we produce?
I think it's gonna carry on growing in popularity. I mean, I think the advantage of podcasts is they are so accessible. You don't need any special equipment to listen to them. It doesn't cost you anything to listen to them. And I think when sort of people have gone back to normal and they've gone back to work, you can still listen on the train to a podcast, or you can still listen in the car to it. And I think, to be honest, what has been really advantageous for ourselves who produce podcasts is people have had the opportunity during lockdown to indulge in this. People have had the opportunity, whereas they might not otherwise have done, to sort of discover how good podcasts can be, and how informative they can be, and how entertaining they can be. And I think really what's happened is that people have realized that it is a short burst of accessible history. It's 45 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that. My commute when I used to work into London was 25 minutes each way. I could listen to a podcast every day to and from work, And I think that's the advantage of it. And I think that's why it makes it so accessible to people. And that's why I always try and keep podcasts around about sort of 50, 55 minutes, something like that, because it's the average length of a commute for people. And I think it will carry on. I think the lockdown was obviously very difficult for everybody in many, many, many circumstances. But for podcasters, I think the lockdown was an amazing opportunity to get people listening to podcasts, and it does become addictive listening to podcasts. There's no doubt whatsoever. I mean, I have a collection of podcasts that I now listen to religiously, whereas before I would occasionally have a listen to something, but I wouldn't describe myself as a podcast listener. Now there are some things that I can't wait till my phone beeps with the notification to say that there's a new episode coming, and I get back into it. And I hope that continues, and I think it will, because I think the podcast listeners are now have available to them such a wide library of opinion and thought and narrative and that sort of thing. It's just a fantastic time to be a podcast listener, and long may that continue.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Matt. Thanks for joining us. If you don't follow Matt on Twitter, that's something you need to address, and we'll put links onto the podcast website. And do make sure that you follow his podcast and listen to it on a regular basis. It's available on all the usual platforms. And again, we'll put some links up there. And Matt, thank you once more for joining us.
Paul, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And I'm so glad to our friend on Twitter who suggested this. So it's been brilliant.
Absolutely. Yeah. Chapeau.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cheers, mate. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.